The context window is the single most scarce and consequential resource in AI today. The problem, to be very specific, is it's not managed very well. And the result is inaccuracies, unpredictability, and bad, or even depending which industry, and potentially catastrophic outcomes. Today's solutions, just plain simple, aren't up to the task. Now, why is this an agent concern? Well, I think for a few reasons. One is if there's thousands of them, as some of the pundits say, are going to be in every enterprise, this clearly brings a sense of urgency. But the interesting thing is that agents are also in the execution plan. They are actually executing steps in the enterprise, which means they can actually capture, perhaps after the fact, decision traces that capture business rules, policy, how the enterprise actually works. So we're going to combine these ideas into two concepts: a minimum viable context. What is the right context provided at the right time for the right token budget, and a runtime component, the virtual context manager, that puts it all together. And we believe these are integral components to the agent ecosystem.
I concur, Eric, and I think that is the focus of today's podcast. As people know, I'm John Miller. I'm based in San Francisco.
My name is Eric Broda, based out of Toronto, Canada, and today's topic is about the virtual context manager and this notion of the minimum viable context.
Okay, so Eric, where do we want to start? I always like to start at the beginning, and I pretend that the beginning is November 2022. Now, it's not really, but it's when the world and I woke up to ChatGPT, and that original feeling we all got when we started to use generative AI in a chat interface, we felt, wow, this thing knows a lot. It knows almost everything we could imagine. So in those early days, I remember that there wasn't a lot of discussion of the context window. I actually remember when ChatGPT added the ability to add a file to your chat, and they called it a GPT. Hey, create your own GPT. You can give it a bunch of instructions and information, and we'll use that for answering your questions. Well, that was that first time they opened up the context window to novices. Let me tell the story of that first context window discussion we had with our customer the summer of 2023. So they were asking us to build a solution. They said, well, show us what generative AI can do. And we're all pretty drunk on the idea that it can do a lot. And the problem we were trying to solve was, if we gave you the right context and put that all in the window, could you answer questions about my business?
Let me kind of build on that, and then I'm going to kind of set you back into the story. But just to take a quick step back, these models, large language models, they're frozen in time based on when they were trained, which really means they do not know anything about your enterprise, your data, how you run. So we came up with these solutions, RAG solutions, retrieval augmented generation, where we loaded data into the LM, or specifically into its context at runtime. Back in the day, and I think even some folks are still using this, there's some pretty naive approaches to actually doing this, where we load arbitrary chunks from a large corpus, PDF documents or whatever, into a vector database. We use similarity searches. And then we find the stuff that is most closely aligned to that user request, and we pop it into the context. John, this is where I'll turn it back over to you, because that's exactly what we did. And what kind of results did we actually see?
Well, what we learned is that you actually have to think deeply about the context window. Remember, and this reminds us of the early days of computing, when our memory size was tiny, like 8K and 4K. That was the size of the context window. So we had these itty-bitty tiny context windows, and different foundation models had different sizes. I mean, I remember Google Bard, before it was called Gemini, had a tiny context window, maybe 4K. And when we would compare it to OpenAI's context window of like 16K, I think it was, over the summer, it dwarfed. We could give more context to OpenAI's model than we could to Google, and so Google just kept looking silly, even though today it's a very different story. So I think that was one of the learnings was, oy vey, the size of the window matters. Remember that
Yeah,
observation?
yeah, you're on a roll, my friend. You continue.
Dude, so what I loved is, remember we were trying to answer the question, how do you actually answer the question? The hypothesis was we could stuff the context window with enough detail that we could answer the question, why did your data pipeline fail last night? Right? And that's a smart thing to go after. We have a lot of data about the data pipelines. We're experts in data engineering. We know a lot about it. So, what information would you put in the window to help the large language models determine why the job failed? Well, probably the most obvious thing is the log, the log of the airflow, right? And, when you look at a log and you try to parse it, you realize, wow, there's a lot of information in the log. I can actually decide what parts of the run log I can put into the context window by doing a similarity search on the job name and that sort of thing. But then we realized to figure out why it failed and what to do about it, you actually had to have the run book information. Now, in the run book at that customer, it would tell you here's the job, who to contact, what to do for different failure modes, because it's been a job that's been running for a long time. They had a lot of description about what to do. So we were able to add the run book to the context window. And so suddenly we could say, we can tell you why it failed, knew what the airflow error messages was. It had already been trained on that, but it also could tell you what to do, because if you had written down rules in your run book about who to call, what to do if this occurs, then we could actually tell you what to do about it. So we thought, wow, we've just invented a way to help data engineers or data operators that are operating the data pipelines. Wow, if we had a newbie, they could immediately just ask and they could find out what to do about a failure. And the purpose of telling you the story is that we learned that stuffing the context window with two types of information actually required us to think about and structure hierarchically how we're going to separate that information in the context window so that we ask the right questions to the right subset of the corpus of data we're searching on. And so we started to realize this is the old search problem again, and the R in retrieval is what that's all about. I remember that vividly. We even have some slides that talk about what we learned in September of 2023. I love it.
Well, I think the most interesting thing, first off, I definitely remember that engagement. The most interesting thing about it, I think, is it comes back to if you want to do this well, you have to have the right content at the right time. And we talked about the token window or the context window size at the right token budget. And if you miss any of those three things, you're going to get something that isn't going to get you the outcome that you want. Here's the challenge is, you could load up the content window and put too much into it. And we know what happens there. You get context rot. The LLM can't see the forest from the trees, I suppose. If you put too little, it can't actually answer the question effectively. So what you really need is what I'd like to call Goldilocks data. You need to have just the right amount of context. Now, the interesting thing about that is that's not the term I'd like to use, although that sounds kind of nice. But the actual technical term that we call that is the minimum viable context. And I think every piece of that word is actually quite important. Minimum means, again, not too much, not too little. The appropriate amount that will be viable under the token budget that can be served as context in the right format to the LLM. So the minimum viable context is actually the goal that we seek. The right context at the right time at the right token budget. That is the goal that we want to achieve. Now, I suppose the question really is, how do we do that?
I also remember the problem we had with the token limits. We actually had to, we were burning so many tokens per unit of time. We actually had to do a lot of research to help Google figure out how to help us change the API limits and work through that. I mean, it was early days for Google Bard. And so doing anything was really kind of hard because these tunables that we've now come to understand as critical were just being discovered. And if I would say one thing about context engineering as we know it today, is we expect it to evolve as aggressively as storage management and all of the things of the last 30 years of computing have taught us.
Yeah. Now, the other part, John, I wanted to just kind of highlight is the right content. And I think there's been a lot of very exciting progress and some innovations in the field, context graphs, decision traces. And these are fantastic innovations. And I think they say one thing very clearly is while the notion of stuffing the context with concepts or meaning is important, it's not sufficient. Okay. In fact, what we're finding, our experience and what we're seeing now in the industry is you actually have to add, what's the right word, policies or rules that define the decision boundaries around the intent behind what the actual user was thinking. Well, there's a bunch of things that go into that. For example, when I say concepts or context cards, we need to think a little bit more specifically. So customer is an intuitive term, but the concept of customer is different based off of senses. Those are things that disambiguate complex concepts. So what that really means is that we may have a concept for customer, yes, an aggregate term, but underneath it, we have a sense for an AML customer. And there's attributes that are specific to an AML customer, which may be different than a billing customer, which may be different than a sales customer. So this intuitive notion actually gets broken down into a hierarchy or smaller components that are very specific to the meaning behind a concept. The other piece of the puzzle, though, is these policies, the decision boundaries that are implied, far too often implied, that we want to make explicit. So when a business process works successfully in a business, there's a logic behind it, a decision boundary. If this, do this. When there's an exception, or under this condition, do this, A, B, or C. Those are business rules that are codified in an enterprise in a whole bunch of different places, standard operating procedures, JIRA tickets, perhaps, logs, or exception reports. But bottom line is there's an opportunity to capture those that define before the fact what the policies or rules, the way the enterprise works ahead of time. Now, the interesting thing about that is I want to relate this back to decision traces. The context around, no pun intended, the context around decision traces is that because an agent is in the path of execution, it can capture the business logic after the fact. And that is absolutely crucial. But here's where policy cards play a significant role. Is the policies define what we expect to happen before the fact. The decision traces explain what happened after the fact. And if we can reconcile those two things, we have a feedback loop that can optimize this. So that's that. I want to bring it back. So that is the other part, the next level down of the minimum viable context.
So you've used the term policy card and content card, and you've defined how that loop could be used between a policy card and a decision trace. I think that's really important because I know that the debate going on since that paper in late December.
Yeah, by Foundation Capital, I think.
What? Yeah, Ashu and Jaya, whom I haven't met yet, but I look forward to discussing this with them at some point. I think that the debate going on in the industry is really good. Now, I want to add one aspect to that there was a post last night about auditable processes. And I just want to say we'll come back to this another time, but in order to create or allow agents to make decisions and record those decisions, we are going to need those decision traces. Those are first class memory or traces or logs of what the agent decided to do at a particular time. And we will need to be able to provide those as evidence of what the agent did in the exact same way that auditors expect regulated processes to be documented and explicitly attested to by another human being saying, that's what I did. This is why I allowed this to happen. So let's talk about that another time because that's a whole other body of knowledge. But I just want to say that That's what I was trying to say last night in a bunch of posts.
Yeah. Well, first off, I think you're spot on. The most interesting thing about this is traditionally everybody has started from the notion of concepts as a first class citizen. And now the industry is evolving to decision traces as a first class citizen. The after the fact. What we're saying is in order to complete that feedback loop, and I think reading the Foundation Capital paper, I think they're implying this. I don't know if they come out loud and clear. Our position is you need to have the policy cards before the fact so you can actually guide the agent, use the decision traces as a first class citizen, policy cards as a first class citizen, and compare the two to complete that feedback loop.
I want to say one thing for our friends with a background in knowledge management who have been doing this since the Library of Alexandria, right? I'm a data management person and I've always loved studying provenance, and my sister's a research librarian. So I got an insider's view of why they are so good at what they do. As a civilization, we've been managing knowledge in libraries. And so they have a lot to say about this. And I want to just acknowledge that we are bringing a naive, conceptually, view to knowledge management. And I suspect that follow up will be to take our simplification of how we think about content and concepts and meaning. And I look forward to extending that with the vast work that very intelligent people have been working on for hundreds, if not thousands of years, right? Just because we're exploring meaning and knowledge management and what is a minimum viable context doesn't mean we're the first. As you learn as you get older, you're almost never the first person to have had these ideas.
Well, first off, absolutely correct. I remember my very first job, and I'm dating myself. This is a very long time ago. I actually worked in a library, and I had firsthand experience with those little library cards, those pieces of paper that index things on author, title, subject. The interesting thing about that is we are standing on the shoulders of giants, as they say. We are just applying a older concept to a newer domain. Now, the interesting thing about this is the analogy is actually very appropriate. The cards, the concept cards, you should think of as that library card. It has a bunch of things. It has the senses that we talked about. It has relationships to the other data, and it actually has a way to actually acquire the data. And the policy cards are very, very similar. Both of these things are probably in some digital format like YAML, probably JSON, and then there'd be a JSON schema that rigorously defines what a card actually looks like. So the analogies are with the library system as a library science is actually very appropriate. But I want to bring one more analogy into play, and this will get us into the virtual context manager. Now, we picked the name of the concept, the virtual context manager, on purpose, because it aligns to an analogy that I'm quite familiar with, and I think most folks in the computer industry are. In the early days, and even today, to a lesser degree perhaps, but you mentioned 8K context windows. I remember my thesis in university was built on a computer that had 8K of RAM, and we used floppy drives, those 5.25-inch things, and I think I may have had 100K disk drive or something like that. But even then, trying to fit what I needed to into this tiny, tiny memory space was trying. And the operating system has a virtual memory manager that allows you to squeeze the right pages on disk into memory so it can actually do its work. So that concept is directly analogous to the context window. Limited RAM equals the limited context window. Disk storage is the corpus that we have available to us in an enterprise. The working set that is used by the computer is our minimum viable context. The pages that are paged in and out are compiled cards. A page fault, to use that term and extending it a little bit, is where we have poor context, or when the decision traces did not match the policy cards and we had an exception occur. So the analogy is actually quite appropriate. So next question, obviously, is if we have this analogy around virtual memory manager equating to a virtual context manager, how do these things actually work? And the interesting thing, spoiler alert, is the concepts apply very, very directly.
You're right, Eric. The analogy between virtual context management and virtual memory management is very appropriate for computer scientists. As you know, I love going to the Computer History Museum in Mountain View all the time, and they have a great exhibit. And I'll include some links in the comments for people that want to see some of the origins, because storing memory in a form that isn't words is something that they explore at the Computer History Museum. Gosh, I wonder if they have research librarians. That would be mind blowing. But it's a great analogy. Do we want to explore it any further, or do we just want to leave it at that for now?
No, no, I do want to explore just a bit. And then I think I want to come back to a
Okay.
concept we know and love, and I think is crucial is the trust, the trust component. But I want to explain a little bit about how the virtual context management will actually work. So this is actually a two-step process. So the first step is, how do I acquire these cards? How do I actually look at my enterprise corpus and actually identify the concepts and then the senses? And there's a bunch of different ways to do that. Natural language processing, using an LLM. So we haven't got the time here to go into detail, but suffice to say that we have to actually go and capture the content from the corpus that's out there. Second thing is we actually have to capture the policies or the rules, the decision boundaries. That's not as easy, but there are some sources that are quite helpful. Standard operating procedures, exception handling, or problem diagnosis procedures are something that would be ripe to actually capture for the policy cards. Interestingly enough, the decision traces, as highlighted in the Foundation Capital article, core to actually figuring out the rules by which the business actually operates. So there's a few places where we can get it, but the key here is we want to actually codify those into a repository, a library, a database, whatever you want to call it, but they have to be accessible. So step number one is creating the concept cards, as well as the policy cards. Step two, and this is, I think, is probably one of the most important steps, is being able to compile the concept context card and the policy card into an actual context. So how do we actually do that? Again, the analogy may break down a bit, but I'll give you a different one here. Databases do this every single day. What they do is they take this text statement, a SQL query. What they do is they analyze it, they decompose it into an acquisition plan that's compiled into an acquisition plan, and then the data is actually acquired based off of that acquisition plan. Obviously, it uses the information that has available, indexes, keys, etc. The same thing for what we do. So we get a prompt that comes in. The context compiler looks at that prompt, identifies the concepts and the policies that are appropriate, creates a context plan, then identifies from the prompt, again, the user request, what are the parameters that provide the, no pun intended here, the context around that specific request, plugs it into the various different, the steps in the context plan, which are data acquisition steps, if you will. And then it actually goes and acquires that data. Near identical to something that we do every single day, the query execution plan, except we, again, standing on the shoulders of giants, we apply it, a well-known concept, to a different domain. And we think that actually provides a mechanism to understand the concept. But here's the thing is, it has been proven time and time again that this overall approach has worked. And we're very confident, based on some of our experience, that it does work for managing the context window in appropriate and token budget aware fashion.
So I wanted to draw one more connection point back to library science. Okay. I love my sister and librarians everywhere. They are important to us because they taught us how to research knowledge. And although we call it a query plan or a SQL execution plan, you guys might draw an analogy to a research plan based on a hypothesis or a research question. We're not going to pretend to be experts in that domain. We do encourage the interdisciplinary approach to knowledge management that has to happen for computer science. And library scientists to help crack the code for knowledge engineering because it is the space that we both respect highly and know that a lot of our language is reusing terms that you would use in a much more precise way. So I just can't state that enough, that that will be part of the evolution of how computer scientists think about knowledge management. This goes to the question of AI in society and how does it know what we know? And there's a lot of important philosophical and other questions that follow on.
It's actually a good lead in because what you're highlighting is, and you didn't say the word, but I'll say it for you, is for all this to work, we have to trust the outcome. We have to trust the actors, the agents that actually do it. We have to trust the information that is provided for the agents to actually do their work. So I'm going to put out uh, a very simple equation, I suppose, that trust in this context is based off of four things. It is based off of provenance of the data. It's based off of explainability of the process that took place, and it is about measuring the outcome and then using the what we expected to happen, what actually happened, and the feedback that corrects the process along the way. So simplistically, trust equals provenance plus explainability plus measurement plus feedback.
I think we should not dig too deep into the formulas for trust because I've got a great one from the consulting industry that it's a slightly different that I also love. But the one word I would add transparency, right? And for multiple stakeholders to be able to examine everything you talked about transparently so that they can draw their own conclusions, they can understand where bias might exist or other forms of logical fallacies that we would need to unpack. So trust, again, is a theme we're going to be coming back to again and again.
Well, was there one thing I wanted to get your feedback on, and I've had debates with colleagues about this specific thing, but here's where I think the rubber hits the road, and I think we have to provide a little bit of a yellow light as we go down this particular path. These policy cards, okay, especially the first iteration of those, are not going to be perfect, and those decisions
No,
that happen after the fact won't capture everything that is actually relevant. So here's the word of advice that we would give is on these policy cards, and as you define and capture the exceptions, the decision boundaries, rules of your enterprise, we strongly advocate human oversight. If not 100% at the start, till a point where you start to get that feedback loop going, confirm that you're actually capturing the right policies, the right decision boundaries that are actually relevant and appropriate. So just a little bit of a warning based on experience where we may want to guide the listener a bit.
I think that's a wrap. We could go on and keep getting into grayer and grayer zones, but let's end it here for now and acknowledge that we're going to be coming back to all of these concepts in future podcasts. And it's been a pleasure to be able to put our ideas together in this podcast and a paper that will follow with this. Thanks, Eric.
Absolutely. Thanks, John.